Just going to begin with this slide. This is a garden in Northcote near my house. What I love about it is that it looks essentially like a piece of bush has just been transplanted right in the middle of suburbia. And there are many design elements that are contributing to what we can see here, and I'm going to go over all of them and some of the reasons why it is effective for biodiversity within our suburbs. So, is that going to change? Okay. So I'll begin by acknowledging that we speak and garden on unceded land. Indigenous nations have never ceded their sovereignty or relinquished ownership, and I warmly welcome any First Nations people here with us today. So who am I? I went to Burnley, Melbourne Uni's horticultural school, and I studied urban horticulture. I worked in garden maintenance for some time, and then did bush regeneration for a few years along the Yarra River, the Maribyrnong River, and Plenty River, Darabin Creek, Merry Creek, all over the place. I did a spring and summer at the Collingwood Children's Farm, and now I work at the Victorian Indigenous Nurseries Cooperative. I also volunteer for the Merry Stationeers and Bush Heritage Australia, and more recently I've been doing a little bit of science communication, like what we're doing today. And all photos in the presentation are my own, so if you have any questions, feel free to shoot them in the chat. So the new ecologies that form in our towns and cities are referred to as novel ecosystems. Speak to anyone born before the year 2000 and they'll have a story to tell about a form of wildlife that was common in their youth, but has since disappeared. An example that I came across in a book by a Sydney naturalist wrote that one year the Christmas beetles were so numerous they weighed down the branches of eucalyptus trees. Nowadays, we're more likely to come across news stories that ask where have all the Christmas beetles gone than to actually see the Christmas beetles for ourselves. In another book I flipped open at the State Library, the last spotted quoll population known to the Melbourne region was mentioned, occurring atop a forested hill in Heidelberg. And within the same book, the suburb where I live in Northcote was referred to as the rural outpost of Northcote. So as time moves forward, the baseline for what we understand as normal continues to shift, and society suffers from a kind of ecological amnesia, where we collectively forget the natural histories of our landscapes. However, ecology is subject to the laws of entropy, and despite localized extinctions and the homogenization of biodiversity, emergent behaviors and unlikely associations continue to evolve. An example that has recently occurred in our area are the eastern water dragons of the Yarra River. They're a subspecies from Far East Gippsland. It's thought that maybe somebody released them as once pets, and they are now flourishing on the Yarra River. So as humans, we mustn't remove ourselves from this equation, and as gardeners, our actions can be critical to generating the habitat within novel ecosystems that plants and animals need to survive. So these plants and animals that are associated with us are called synanthropic species. The term synanthropic comes from the Greek syn, meaning together or with, and anthropos, meaning human, so together with human. Many of the classic synanthropic species that occur around the city of Yarra, such as magpies, possums, rainbow lorikeets, flying foxes, the marbled gecko pictured here, and many more, are generally far more successful and numerous among novel ecosystems than what is left of their natural habitat, meaning that they have successfully adapted to the changes that we've brought to our landscapes. So when we create gardens among novel ecosystems, if possible, we should attempt to exclude as many of the more numerous synanthropic species, and that is to make space for and encourage other native species that we know are in decline. Things like microbats, small birds, sugar gliders are another one that have made a comeback. They've begun appearing around Burundara, in Darabin Parklands, and the other one is our insects. I'm sure we've all heard about the insect apocalypse. I often hear people talk about the windshield phenomenon, which is the observation that when you drive long distances, there are many less insects smeared across the windscreen than in past decades, which is crude, but it's something that we can all recognize. So now I want to introduce the concept of landscape complexity. Landscape complexity refers to the diversity of forms and structures within ecosystems that all forms of life need to survive. While plants, and particularly indigenous plants, are a part of this complexity, there are many other structural elements of our environment that are equally important to the life around us. I found myself mildly fascinated by a gardener in the UK named John Little. The way he describes landscape complexity has opened my mind to new ideas that I think are worth considering. He preaches the value of shopping trolleys in waterways as habitat for young fish who may otherwise be consumed by large fish. He conducts rigorous scientific surveys of the insect diversity associated with dumped rubbish piles and fast food wrappers, and he highlights the prolific wildlife thriving among the defunct factories in abandoned industrial districts. I've added a link to some of his work to the talk, and we'll add a few links in the chat as we go. So if you're curious about some of this stuff that I'm talking about, they are resources to find more information. So while I'm certain that advocating for an increase in the number of abandoned factories in our neighborhoods would get me in all sorts of trouble, there is a finer point to these provocations. Once we accept that wildlife is likely to occur in places that we may also consider as neglected brownfield, we may attempt to understand the nuances of why they are there. So this is an image showing a quieter, undeveloped corner of Royal Park. This unkept grassland and rock dump is typical of a landscape easily perceived as messy or unsightly, even dangerous for fear of snakes. However, it is precisely the unkept complexity that provides habitat for a range of wildlife. So here we have an eccentric bug with the unfortunate name of the slant-faced grasshopper, perfectly camouflaged among the dried thatch of these invasive grasses growing in Royal Park, around 10 meters away from where the previous image was taken. Most landscape complexity is currently incidental, but if we acknowledge that the complexity of our landscapes is precisely what determines the diversity of life that occupy them, we can begin to design and shape this complexity in a way that is both beautiful and ecologically functional. So that begins with an understanding of the distinction between indigenous, native, and exotic plants. So indigenous plants, all indigenous plants are native, but not all native plants are indigenous. Indigenous plants are species that are closely tied to specific local areas. And in Melbourne, we define these areas by our river catchments. So at Vink, the nursery where I work, we collect all of our seed material, all of our cuttings, all of what are called propagules from the Yarra catchment, which is from around Wallen all the way across to the Dandenong Ranges and then down to Diets Falls. And all of the plant material that is growing at Vink has provenances throughout that region. So native plants refer to species that occur naturally within a country's borders. So in our context, any plant that naturally occurs on Australian soil is considered native. Conversely, exotic plants are species that originate from outside of Australia. These are plants that have been introduced either intentionally or unintentionally and are not a part of Australia's natural flora. So as somebody who works for an Indigenous plant nursery, it may be against my professional imperative to advocate for non-Indigenous plants. However, there is a level of nuance and pragmatism that is frequently left out of the conversation between local and exotic plants. And as with most dogmatic binaries, and in the context of street gardens, what is best is probably somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of each as I have come to understand them. So the use of Indigenous plants in street gardens is generally to provide the diversity that is co-evolved with local climatic conditions and biodiversity. Many life forms rely on specialized relationships with Indigenous plants, meaning that without communities of Indigenous plants, those life forms would cease to exist. Using Indigenous plants in the garden means relinquishing our subjectivity to our broader ecology and decentering ourselves as gardeners. Instead of imposing our personal taste or an aesthetic trend, using Indigenous plants requires a kind of dissolution of the gardener's ego. This is opposed to more traditional garden design, which functions like a kind of terrarium, closed off from much of the natural world and rarely considering the landscape beyond the confines of property. There is also a cultural element to our knowledge and celebration of Indigenous plants. When we interact with the ecology that we coexist with, it deepens our connection to place and strengthens our cultural identities. So unfortunately, restoring ecosystem function is not as simple as just planting Indigenous plants. Ultimately, Indigenous plants belong in Indigenous ecosystems, and under the noxious pressures of contemporary human disturbances and pollution, we must recognize that the novel ecosystems of our towns and cities are vastly different from the ecosystems that these plants evolved in. And while there are still plenty of Indigenous plants that can handle these increased pressures, it varies depending on each individual species. Some more food for thought comes in the way of climate change. According to our best estimates, by 2050, Melbourne may have a comparable climate to that of Dubbo in central New South Wales. If we transported a selection of Indigenous plants from Melbourne to Dubbo and planted them today, then considered Dubbo's harsher climate, characterized by lower rainfall, increased winter frosts, and summer temperatures averaging more than 4 degrees Celsius higher than Melbourne, how well would these plants cope? So this is a picture I took at the Botanic Gardens. It was taken at the height of the Black Summer bushfires. You can see the haze in the background. I was also in lockdown at the time, and I would sometimes go to the Botanic Gardens, which was just within my boundary. And on this particular day, I was met with this fallen giant. It is a American white oak, Quercus alba. It is a really good example of what happens when a plant reaches its threshold, and it sort of happened at this really apocalyptic time, probably for all of us, and it really kind of moved me. And then the in-house landscape architect, Andrew Laidlaw, from the Botanic Gardens, has actually designed an Indigenous garden around the fallen tree, and they've sculpted the wood into benches as a temporary display. And yeah, it's quite a moving scene, and I would encourage everybody to go and visit it because it sort of is a really good example of how to tell a story that sort of moves away from, I guess, an exotic, maybe colonial, you might even call it, landscape, and then the renewal process of what we can do with Indigenous plants. So now I want to talk about native plants. I've been reading a book called The Skeptical Botanist by Tim Entwistle, the recently retired head of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Victoria. In one of the first chapters, he points out that the island nation of New Caledonia, located 1,500 kilometres off the east coast of Australia, is home to many plants closely related to Australian flora. Melbourne is closer to New Caledonia than it is to Perth, yet we classify plants from Perth as native and plants from New Caledonia as exotic. This observation questions the utility of the strict distinction between native and exotic flora. So with this in mind, we may choose to take a more nuanced approach to the use of native and some exotic plants in novel ecosystems. In this context, it is the case that some non-Indigenous plants may be more suited to the provision of food and habitat and ecological services than some of their Indigenous counterparts. This is because the conditions of gardens, especially street gardens, more closely resemble the drier regions of Australia. So pictured is a good example of that. If you think about this small sliver of a street garden, none of these plants are Indigenous. They are native. There's a grevillea and a lomandra through there. And if you just think about the concrete around it, the fact that it's on a main road on Wellington Street, and would be subject to all sorts of, there's a school over the road, there's a pub up the street. So this garden would be going through a lot, yet it looks wonderful and would be providing a lot of food and habitat for any insects or animals in transit. So exotic plants. This is a small exotic garden on McKean Street in Clifton Hill. It is beautiful by any gardener's standard. The diversity in there is impressive. However, I would say that it wouldn't be doing much except for providing nectar for honeybees. So the primary concern with the use of exotic plants in street gardens is their weed potential. So many of Australia's worst weeds are plants that have escaped our gardens and invaded natural areas. Many estimates are that around 20 new species of weed emerge in Australia each year. So if you live near natural areas, especially waterways, you shouldn't use exotic flora in the garden. The risk of escape is far too great and will likely mean that land managers will have to use herbicides to attempt eradication, which can lead to other unintended negative consequences for the health of our ecosystems. I often talk to people about herbicides. A lot of people have concerns about herbicides, which I completely share. There are many legislative wins that Europe have had, and even America has had, that Australia hasn't even begun to talk about in terms of herbicides. But in saying that, it is the only tool that we have right now to prevent the wholesale destruction of a lot of our ecosystems. So in the right context, it is a solution that buys time until there is a better solution, essentially. But in the garden, in the street garden, it's essentially unnecessary and it's just harmful. So, really, unless maybe not everybody can dig. Some people might have arthritis or something like that, and in that circumstance, it's just another tool. So plants are unpredictable. For instance, there are many cases of trees and other plants which were not weeds until they incidentally hybridized with a closely related species. And we can never fully discount the possibility that plants can change or behave in very unexpected ways. A quick example is the willow tree that is choking a lot of waterways throughout agricultural regions, and there are still quite a few of them along the Merri Creek near me. Those trees are actually a hybrid of the North American oak and the European oak, so they never would have crossed paths without us bringing them together. Okay, so one interesting ecological downside to the use of many popular exotic plants like roses, dahlias, carnations, anemones, camellias, and many more is the concept of double flowers. Many of these famously beautiful flowering plants have been bred by horticulturalists for many generations. Their goal is usually to improve the flower for aesthetic purposes, but in doing so, they select for configurations of flower petals that completely block access to the nectaries at the center of each flower, thereby rendering the flowers ecologically useless for birds, insects, and other animals that feed on nectar. So I would encourage anyone that has any of those, what we call old world plants in their garden, to have a closer look at the flowers and see if they have this sort of arrangement that you can see on the left, because it is common, especially in camellias. I'm sure it's common in other things. This is just the one that I see around the most, but it might be worth reconsidering that plant. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by all of the information I've relayed, I've just added this slide as a quick tool for guaranteed success. It is not an exhaustive list of all of the Indigenous plants that can thrive in street gardens, but they are widely available species, and I would bet on their success in almost any context. I would use these species as a base for any street garden, and then maybe add some native plants or something that you might find more charismatic. So one interesting plant family to take note of is the Fabaceae family, also known as the legume, pea, or bean family. The most well-known Australian member of the family are the wattles. However, there are hundreds of other Victorian species, as well as from all around the country. The reason I've dedicated a slide to this family is because these plants are uniquely suited to grow in the conditions of novel ecosystems. Along with their general hardiness, they have the ability to generate their own fertilizer through a bacterial relationship in their roots. So now I want to talk about the practicalities of street gardens, beginning with soils. So soils are sometimes referred to as substrates. Inert substrates in this context are mineral-based soils, meaning that they are entirely composed of rocks and lack any organic matter. So you can see here in this native meadow street garden at VCA in the city, that these indigenous plants are happily growing in an inert substrate of basaltic origin. This particular substrate is a waste material of local quarrying, meaning that it is readily available at most landscape yards at a low cost. Other inert substrates are available too, like quarried sandstone and granite. However, they come with varying degrees of environmental sustainability. Most indigenous plants and many other native and exotic plants can grow in this seemingly hostile substrate without any issues. And the primary benefit of using an inert substrate is that many of the common weeds of street gardens prefer to grow in nutrient-rich topsoil. So by removing the nutrient-rich topsoil from a street garden and replacing it with an inert substrate, along with the right selection of plants and planting techniques, we remove the necessity for the endless cycle of mulching and weeding. This is not to say that it is a silver bullet for any maintenance whatsoever. Plants may take a little longer to establish, which can be ameliorated with a monthly light application of liquid fertilizer. They may also require more water during their first summer, and there are still some tenacious weeds that will find a way to grow. The science of growing plants in inert substrates is currently being investigated by Melbourne Uni on the roof of the Burnley campus, but it is already widely accepted as best practice in the UK and parts of Europe. I'll provide some further examples and links of its use around Melbourne towards the end of this talk. So one aspect of many street gardens that I think should change is the overemphasis on plant diversity at the expense of establishing plant communities. Consider a natural ecological system. Here we have a photo from Wilson's Prom, a photo from the Victorian High Country, and a photo from the Otways. How often do you enter a forest and see just one individual of a plant species growing all by itself? It doesn't happen. And here are three examples, and I can guarantee that if you walk into a landscape, a natural landscape, and look around, often you will see a number of species. However, they are repeated throughout large areas, but our gardens tend to just have this sort of one of everything approach. So plants grow in communities, and animals habitually travel to these plant communities, often with prior knowledge of resource availability. This is because many animals will teach their young when and where to find certain resources, meaning that by planting populations of plant species, we can contribute to intergenerational habitat. So the example I give people when they're at the nursery to try and convince them is to imagine if they walked into a sandwich shop for lunch earlier today. But to acquire the sandwich, you had to visit 6 different cafes, one for the bread, one for the lettuce, another for the mayonnaise, and so on. Many birds that live in suburban areas are forced to do something similar when they spend valuable time and energy endlessly foraging for the next morsel. But by planting in multiples, we vastly increase the amount of resources available and reduce their need to roam. So they might just come to one garden and stay there for the duration of that resources flowering lifespan. So while having many different plant species present in a broader landscape is important for biodiversity, the way this diversity is distributed through our suburban landscapes is equally important. So when we create street gardens, the way that we can contribute to the establishment of plant communities is by using a repetition of species. That is, planting multiples of the same species within each garden and not getting too carried away with not having like a collector's mindset, but more so just choosing a smattering of your favorite and then having a lot of them. So depending on the size of a street garden, I would usually recommend choosing 3 to 5 species to repeat within each garden instead of, say, 10 different plant species crammed into the one space. So layering your planting is how we build complexity and make the most of any space available to us. Think of it like stacking plants on top of one another. The ground cover forms the base, shrubs create the next layer, followed by mid-story plants, and finally a canopy of street trees. Additionally, climbing plants can grow freely among the layers, and ephemeral tuberous plants may add a seasonal base layer. So one issue I commonly see in all kinds of gardens, but especially street gardens, is the sparsity of plantings. It may be a symptom of the upfront costs of purchasing plants and establishing a new garden, or maybe because we tend to want to savor the experiences of planting, or maybe because we are have that collector's mindset that I mentioned earlier. And while it is okay to add to gardens over time, the initial planting work and technique is critical for long-term success. My recommendation is to plant within half of the total size of each plant. So here we have kangaroo grass, Themata triandra. Usually it grows to around 60 centimeters wide. And so these plants have been planted 30 centimeters apart. And by planting in such close proximity, we create a kind of living mulch, helping the soil to stay cool and retain moisture, minimizing space for any weeds to establish by covering all bare soil and create the landscape complexity that wildlife need. And in this example, you can see above, there is still plenty of space to plant in between these grasses. Yeah, most native plants, there's a lot of mythology around competition. These would work fine with a Fabaceae planted among them, that sort of thing. So one method of achieving density, especially on a budget, is the use of tussock grasses, or alternatively, rhizomous or tuberous plants that can be divided into many plants. So here's a Lamandra, Poa labelladieri, and you can see I've just cut it directly down the middle and created 2 plants out of it. Could probably even get 4 plants out of that one. But if you buy those, sometimes they're on the discounted rack because they really need to go in the ground. Yeah, you can just speak to the horticulturalists at nurseries, and they should be able to give you the best options available if you're working with a budget and you want to maximize how many plants you can get. So one challenge you may encounter in street gardens are desire lines. They are the paths of least resistance, occurring in parks and public gardens in defiance of sealed pathways and paved areas. Often creating shortcuts, these trails of compacted earth reveal how people prefer to move through the landscape. Generally, they're a symptom of poor urban planning, but yeah, we don't really do urban planning on a nature strip scale. And so it's something that we need to think about as street gardeners. Many of our street gardens will be subjected to the desire lines created as people enter and exit their vehicles. If you live close to a school or a train station, you may find that the increased foot traffic will inevitably lead to a desire line through the center of your garden. However, this is just one of the many challenges posed by gardening in the public realm. And while you can attempt to restrict the use of a desire line by installing a physical barrier, a polite sign, or even the use of a prickly plant, I think the best way to address the problem is by formalizing a route through the garden. The example pictured here shows a street garden of mostly native lemongrass, Cymbopogon. If you look closely, the area along the road's edge has been neatly paved with bricks, so anyone entering or exiting their car doesn't step on the garden. So in this context, landscape continuity refers to how we can use street gardens to extend the visual and ecological impact of our homes and gardens. In this image, the nature strip connects with the front garden through a recessed fence line of the house, thereby softening the boundaries between the street and the home. We can see 2 plant species from the internal garden also growing in the street garden, furthering that continuity of the landscape. Additionally, the fence design is secure but penetrable, still allowing vegetation to freely grow through it. This has the effect of momentarily inviting people into the garden and can make the street feel like a much more welcoming place to traverse. Where I live, I've just removed my front fence entirely and replaced it with plants. And if you have the capacity to do the same, that's always a good thing to do, in my opinion. So natural features may include existing rocks, logs, topography like a boggy depression or mounded soil. These are all a part of landscape complexity that contribute to valuable habitat. I want to emphasize the word existing. It is against the guidelines to bring in rocks and logs into a street garden. However, if there is something there already, yeah, it's valuable and use it to the best of your ability. Or don't remove it, I should say. So these logs I photographed were outside of property near the Grampians. you know, there was a stump nearby, and an arborist had cut down this tree and just laid these logs like this, and just really beautiful sculptural element, but also these nooks and crannies among that would be providing for all sorts of life. And I really like the idea of it sort of remaining in context as well. For whatever reason, the tree, you know, is better standing upright, but maybe it was dangerous, or maybe it fell on its own. I don't know. So similarly, unnatural features from legacy landscaping or previous plantings can provide opportunities for creative reimagination. While most people would usually send this kind of material to landfill, this example shows a better way by creating a sculptural element that also contributes to the story of the landscape. Think the Quercus alba, the American white oak. The story of the landscape is really part of our cultural story as much as ecological. So I actually spoke to the homeowner of this house. He was an architect and a sculptural artist. And he said that he's seen blue-tongue lizards living among his sculptures. So that's a big win for a suburban habitat. So one technique that greatly adds to landscape complexity and avoids landfill is the use of gabion cages. They can be used as retaining walls, planters, garden benches, or sculptural elements. Here are two examples of gabion cages. One has been filled with a medley of neatly arranged building rubble and then planted into, and the other is filled with riverstone. So the issue with the gabion cage on the right, even though it is sort of aesthetically consistent with a lot of native gardens, is that it is extractive. Those riverstones have been removed from somewhere and then trucked into a landscaping yard before being bagged and sold. And the fact is that riverstones provide crucial habitat for aquatic plants and animals, and they prevent erosion. So our construction of habitat should never be at the expense of another habitat. And that's what I would say is a broad general principle. On the other hand, using a rubble to fill the gabion cages on the left is diverting a waste material from landfill while creating habitat and contributing to the story of landscape. And while you're not allowed to have gabion cages anywhere on a street garden, this is something that you might think about on the internal garden, or maybe even write a email to Yarra Council and see if you can get some movement. So there are endless ways to introduce complexity into the garden. It is up to us to observe and learn from the natural landscape, and then appropriate how we can reproduce these systems and structures within our suburbs. A quote that comes to mind from an American gardener named Kelly D. Norris is, "A scientist's mind with an artist's heart." Experimentation and patience are key. Some of these systems can take up to a lifetime to establish, but we have to start somewhere. Take every opportunity to retrofit habitat into your garden. And when you see something that is working, replicate it. Nobody working in this space is doing so for themselves. Ultimately, more gardens means more plants. More plants means more bugs. And when we get the bugs right, all of the other charismatic life follows. And when we can't get a Coles or a Woolworths knocked down and replaced with a nature park, we need to make the most of every opportunity available to provide this complexity within our landscapes. So now I'm just going to quickly walk you through the process of creating a small street garden near my house as a part of the Merry Stationers. So here you can see a site with some weeds. The soil level is kind of coming over the edge, and some existing rocks. I first removed the top 100 mil of soil, which was containing the nutrient-rich soil as well as the seed bank, the weed seed bank. And then I ripped the subsoil a little bit to just break up a bit of that hard earth. And I arranged the rocks in what is considered a naturalistic fashion, which is you plant the rocks at least 20 centimeters below the soil level to make them appear as though they've been there forever, as well as place them in odd numbers and make them look like they were once a part of a much larger rock, so millions of years ago. And those sort of principles help a landscape look a lot more naturalistic, if that's something you're interested in. So I asked a local landscaping yard about what inert substrates they had. It has to be something 8 mil or smaller. You can get scoria, Tuscan toppings, granitic sand, basaltic crusher dust. I went for the basaltic crusher dust because it was the cheapest and because of the existing basalt rocks, I wanted that material consistency. And then I placed my selection of native and indigenous plants. I've got two Mallee eucalypt trees, and you can see the density of those plants there. They are Eremophila deserti, maybe? Oh, no, I can't remember the name of that Eremophila. I got some cuttings from a plant nearby and grew the Eremophilas, and then I purchased those Mallee trees from Ceres. And then you can see in the image on the right, I also grabbed a bunch of native grasses from Vink. That's Ostrastipa elegantissima, which birds love the seed of, and there's a butterfly that lays its caterpillar larvae on that grass. So yeah, you can see the density of the planting. You can also see that there is a disabled parking spot in the background there. So you have to be wary of plants that may grow over the path. Now I'm out here doing maintenance with the Merry Stationers quite often, and so that path line will remain trimmed as the plants grow, but that's something to be aware of as well. So I topped it with a rock mulch of basalt as well, just to get that material consistency again. I watered it. I have watered it twice, but I will water it weekly over the summer, and I'll be giving it a very light liquid fertilizer once a month over the warmer months, and then it can just take care of itself over the cooler months. And yeah, the total cost was around $350. It will be different for every size street garden. And I also want to say that if you don't have the capacity to be moving soil around and moving rocks around, which is, totally fine because, we can't all do that. This technique is the other way to do it, which is a lot more simple. And you just smother the area with a tarp for 3 weeks, a month, however long it takes for the vegetation underneath to die. And then once you plant into it, make sure you're mulching. You make sure you use chunky hardwood mulch chips, not the composted stuff or the dyed mulch that the real estate agents seem to really like. And yeah, the other thing I just wanted to say as well, you can see here that the level, I've made sure the level is actually below the lip of the edge of the garden. And I think it's really critical that you don't build soil up into mounds, because then as the water falls on it, it just runs to the side and you don't get any water penetration. Plants won't grow. Soil's not good. So I have almost run out of time, so I'm just going to quickly talk you through three examples of inert substrates being used around Melbourne right now. This is something I think everyone should go and visit. There's links that will be in the chat, as well as links in the presentation here where you can read about this work and go and visit it, take some cues, take some notes. But yeah, just try and figure out what's right for you. You can see the Melbourne Meadows project looked beautiful for, I think this was maybe the second year, looked beautiful for a number of years. It doesn't look like this anymore, so you have to sort of be aware of how much inputs you're going to be putting into the landscape, as well as how much maintenance you're willing to put into the landscape. So here's another one, the Woody Meadows project on Birrarung Ma. This is the classic one. Really, really great complexity. This is managed by coppicing, which is a technique that some native plants respond well to, where you can cut them right at the base and they'll reshoot. Definitely read about that one. Also an inert substrate, no irrigation as well, which is really impressive. Then there's the test garden at Fed Square. This is they're testing for a much more extensive garden that's going up around the Arts Centre. There's heaps of workshops and information and things happening around this garden right now, but it's a really good example of exotic plants, indigenous plants, native plants all working really well together. So a really good place to get some inspiration. And this inert substrate as well is so hostile. I think it's like less than 30 centimeters deep, because they're trialing it for like a almost like a roof garden kind of method. So go check that one out. And I'll just quickly say, if your garden is harboring invasive plants, like on the left here, give up, call the council, tell them you can't do it anymore because it's just not worth harboring these Hedrohelix, this English ivy, terrible plant. And also if your plants are being consumed, like this eucalyptus in my yard is recently, that is a big win. That means you've got butterflies on the way. So love your lava. That's a strange thing to say. And finally, cues to care, messy ecosystems, orderly frames. This single piece of writing radicalized me to be the gardener I am today. It is so well written. It is beautifully written. I've never come across a scientific article so well written, and it will really give you the perspective to understand how to manage a public landscape in a way that everyone else perceives as managed and cared for, but also is providing for biodiversity, because there's a lot of cultural barriers to how people perceive landscapes as like either safe. Often what is considered unsafe happens to also be what's really good for biodiversity, and what happens to be considered beautiful is just depauperate. There's no life there. So it really deals with some of those issues. And that's it from me. Thanks so much for listening. I'm going to hand it over to Jane, and Jane's going to give us a little bit more information. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was fabulous. While I'm presenting, please also feel free to put any questions in the chat, and then I'll also attempt to unmute you because there's not that many of us. We can see if we can ask some questions directly. So we've got till 8:15 this evening. So I just wanted to touch base now, just to quickly share my screen. Okay. So just before I get into a brief presentation on Yarra and other street gardens and My Smart Garden, just wanted to let you know that you will be getting an email from us with a survey that we would really love you to fill in. It's really important to get feedback and ideas from our community so that we can keep delivering these fabulous workshops to you all. And a copy of this presentation will be put on the My Smart Garden, hopefully within the next couple of weeks, if not next week itself. So for those of you that are new to My Smart Garden, it's a free program that is run by 10 councils across Melbourne. We run quite a diversity of workshops, and they are all free. And then we house the resources on our website, such as what you can see here. So I just typed in habitat in the resources section, and these were just a few of the things that came up in looking for habitat planning and the like. And then there's a monthly newsletter which I also invite you to sign up for, so that you can hear about events when they're coming up and all sorts of other community and other wonderful tips on seasonal food growing if you're a food grower and other things. Okay, so just on street gardens, as Michael referred to a couple of times, there's certain rules, and each council has different rules depending on whether you can do street gardening or not. It certainly is a growing trend in Melbourne. And in Yarra, it was very much in response to the fact that so many residents were doing this anyway. So it was about trying to put some good structure around this and encouraging people to grow local Indigenous or local native plants as much as possible. And in Yarra, you can, a street garden is a non-edible community-led planting initiative in council-managed streetscapes. So in this instance, it's nature strips, or where your lawn might be if you are lucky enough to have a green space outside your house, existing tree squares which are located in the footpath or tree squares in the road, and also what are called street beds, which you often find in the corner. So similar to what Michael showed us at Mary train station. Yarra does not permit planting in median strips or tree squares in the centre of the road, and this is for your safety, but also for the safety of road users in terms of sight lines in particular. So key elements to consider is that, your council might call it a different name. So try things like nature strip gardening or street gardening. A really important element is to remember to talk to your neighbours and just let them know that this is something that you'd like to do, and see if they might be interested in getting involved. Remember that there's often services under the ground. So at the beginning of the session, I put in a link to our street garden guidelines, which includes a link to Before You Dig Australia. And similarly, from a safety perspective, we also have a link to EPA's Safe Garden guidelines, in particular because of the contaminated soils that we have in the inner city. And that's part of why we don't allow people to grow edible plants in these soils, because we don't know what's in them or what's being put on them, and we don't want people eating vegetables and getting unwell. A key thing, and again, Michael's already mentioned this, is around maintenance. So if you do want to take on a street garden, just consider that, will you be needing to water it regularly? Will there be weeds? What happens if you go away for a couple of months? Just so thinking about what it is that you're taking on, and hence, great to talk to your neighbours and get them involved in helping out as much as possible. And then this again is from our particular guidelines, and most likely similar to some of the others that are around Melbourne, but thinking about access, so people getting in and out of vehicles, making space for rubbish bins, making sure you're not damaging the roots of the trees that you might be planting around, and keeping accessibility, making sure that the footpath is wide enough for people with large prams or wheelchairs and the like, and heights. So again, sight lines, being able to see traffic, whether it's foot traffic, cyclists or people in vehicles. And as Michael mentioned, we can't have added extras, as I call them, so rocks or pot plants, or recently had a request for what is it, the synthetic turf to make their site beautiful. Yeah. All right. So that's the key aspects in terms of street gardens. I want to open up to the group to see if there are any questions. I will stop sharing. And
I can see Marion has said that she has a problem with dogs. I have a similar problem with dogs on my nature strip. I think Emma Cutter, the Melbourne pollinator corridor gardener, was talking about this the other day as well. But she spoke about sacrificial plants, in that if you do have dogs urinating on the garden, often they'll be urinating on the same plant. And so just like keeping that dead plant in place and not pulling it out, so then they go and find the next thing, that actually has worked for me. I've got a Spiridium, a small shrub in the corner, and it has been dead for 6 months now, and they continue to just wee on that individual. So yeah, don't just have that sacrificial lamb, you know? That's all I have to say about that.
Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to put in the chat, or let me know that you'd like me to take you off mute and you can ask a question directly? Great advice from Marion. Thank you, Marion. Um, and lovely comment there, Karen. Thank you. Yes, it's been a fabulous presentation from Michael. I've heard from, this is the third presentation. We've had a couple of face-to-face as well. So it's been great to hear the questions that have been coming, the different ideas that people have.
Thanks so much, Jane. It's been really good.
Yeah. Right, well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, Michael, so I think we can finish up there. So thanks again. As I said, we'll be putting this recording on the My Smart Garden website, and I'll be sending out an email tomorrow, the next day. Thanks, Victoria, with the links that I shared in the chat here and a few other. Michael did mention a book. What was the name of that book again, Michael?
The Skeptical Botanist by
That's right.
Tim Entwistle. It's new. It's really good, and it's a collation of all of his articles from all over all the magazines and other places that he's written, online articles, all the best ones he's written over the years, and they've all sort of been updated. It's really good. It's funny. He's a great writer. Highly recommend it.
Fabulous. Okay, well, I will finish up there. Thanks again, everyone, for coming along. And yeah, we'll see you at the next event.
Bye bye.
Bye.